In the mid 80s, I was very interested in ways to create a sense of gender confusion. I was with a circle of friends who were really interested in messing with conventional notions of gender. It would seem quite tame at this point, but I got interested in jewelry, particularly just sort of thrift store finds and things like that, as things to wear to what I would have said, called at the time, misgender myself. And this got me interested in jewelry and what sort of social functions it has and how it operates. And I just, over the course of several years, began making jewelry until I ultimately took an entry-level jewelry class. And a few years after that, decided to go back to grad school for jewelry. I took a beginning jewelry class with Anne Graham at the University of Delaware. And I can honestly tell you that as cliche as it sounds, the first time I held a soldering torch in my hand, that felt very right. I really did feel just a physical connection to the materials and processes of jewelry making and metalsmithing once I started pursuing them. But I also have always been a very didactic artist. I was very particularly interested in saying a certain set of things, and jewelry turned out to be the medium that I felt I could say those things most effectively and most tied into the essential nature and history of the medium. Jewelry turns out to have an extremely rich and deep history of connections, of course, with the personal, with the bodily, with the intimate, with the sentimental. And all of those were attributes that I felt would be very useful in pursuing the subject matter I was most interested in, which was gay male identity, queer identity in general, and the situation that I found myself in the mid 80s, which was smack dab in the middle of the AIDS pandemic, along with all other people in the queer community at that time. And so jewelry just turned out to mesh with subject matter that I was both engaged with and interested in. And as a means of exploring all of that, jewelry was just perfect. My early work was a direct attempt to engage in jewelry with the legacy, both on me personally and on my community of gay men, of the AIDS pandemic. And as such, the earliest work were memorial pieces to people who I happen to know who died of HIV. And an early piece from the work I did in graduate school was called 35 Dead Souls. And what it is a series of neck pieces, simple wires with pendants, and each pendant is a highly stylized bird's head, basically. The shapes kind of circle around that long, fragile, big-eyed bird skull kind of feeling. And then they're all embodied in one way or another, either generally or specifically, with symbols of loss, degeneration, loss of mental faculties, physical weakness, things like that. And 35 of them hang on these sort of bouncy chains. And one of them just hangs on a cord, which is a self-portrait. I am fortunate to have reached this late stage in my life uninfected, but there is absolutely no reason as a gay man who came out in the late 70s that I dodged that virus. And so I'm in the middle of this mass of pendants, and when you wear them, they form about a soccer ball size mass of material that you wear around your neck, and they bounce up and down when you walk. And it was an important piece to me because I felt like not only was it leveraging the history of mourning jewelry that jewelry has, but it also physically embodied the notion of a burden. and a burden that manifested itself as you went about your business. Because one of the core questions for gay men in the 80s is, how do I continue to be myself? When one of the core facts of selfhood in the coming out process is sexual. How do I continue to be myself and yet face up to the sexually transmitted disease that is denying me, or at least making it very scary, to pursue activities which are central to my identification and manifestation of self? And because these necklaces manifest their weight and their burden when you're going about your business, I felt that was a very successful piece of jewelry in embodying a broad range of thoughts. In the early 2000s, I began a pretty long love affair with the country of Brazil. And I began going there and began going there a lot. Ultimately, actually began a relationship in Brazil, which lasted for 14 years. A very long distance relationship. That relationship has ended now, but before that relationship began, I started working on a very complex piece called Vai Virar, which means shall become in Portuguese. And it's a piece that concerns itself with the complexities of a small war in Brazil called the War of Canudos. And it was a dangerous piece for me to make, because basically what I was doing was injecting myself as a good old colonialist American into another culture and making work about their history. And it's the most complex thing I've ever made. It was very complex technically, but also extremely complex conceptually, in the way that it tries to create an object which simultaneously represents both sides of a war, simultaneously recognizes loss of identity and life on both sides of that war, that acknowledges the long-term legacy of that war and the class distinctions that war was based in, that persist in Brazil to this day and are echoed in other places in the world, including the US. And that piece took, about 2 years of research and a couple of years of physical making, off and on, because I teach as well. Although the piece isn't widely known, I think it's the most successful piece of jewelry I've ever made, because it, I think, manages to effectively achieve this very complex set of goals while still remaining a piece of jewelry, rather than a polemic or a pile of stuff. It's certainly the hardest thing I've ever done. And so for me, it really represents a stage in my career where I felt like, okay, this is everything I imagined a piece of jewelry could be. The rest is kind of gravy. I can make what I feel like from now on, because this set of goals that I've been working to, of acknowledging the past, honoring memory, giving respect to pain. I managed to do all that in the ways that I'd always dreamed of doing, that had always been sort of my artistic goal. And so that's a very important piece to me as well. I've been working for quite a long time on a series called The Saddest Aisle, which the saddest aisle is when you go to a thrift store, like Goodwill or Value Village or something like that, the saddest aisle is the aisle of abandoned baskets, which to me are unutterably sad and pathetic. And so my work has always dealt in fairly explicit ways with notions of loss and obligations to memory, obligations to the past, acknowledgement of death, things like that. And that's usually been focused on, aspects of the queer community, starting with the AIDS pandemic. But I became really interested in a more general sense for how these sad abandoned baskets we're stand-ins, or not really stand-ins, we're witnesses of all sorts of domestic realities. They just sit on a shelf and take it all in. And I think part of the sadness of that, all those abandoned baskets, is that they have been an intimate presence in people's lives, and then they're not useful anymore, they're not wanted anymore, they get too dusty, and they're just tossed aside. And I conceived this sort of silly idea that they needed to be honored for their devoted watching over us. And so what I do is I take portions of baskets from Goodwill, and I actually electroform them and turn them into metal, or surround them with metal. And then I ornament them very much in the tradition of ornamental bejeweled jewelry. So the reference points there really are more to less to jewelry actually than to the jeweled reliquary and other objects that have been created to themselves contain objects that have significance and meaning and holiness and things like that. And so I've been engaged for about 10 years on a kind of a slow process of trying to find different ways to gussy up these fragments of baskets, just as a kind of a thank you to them, and a kind of a walking acknowledgement of what they did and what they stand for. So that's my current ongoing project. And I've talked primarily and worked entirely within whatever you'd loosely call art jewelry. But craft is much broader than that, and the social meanings of craft are important in that broad field. Limited production jewelry, utilitarian handmade pottery, these enrich the world really significantly. And the council, I think, has always manifested and continues to manifest an understanding of that range, as well as the interconnection between crafts fields. So I very much value that.